Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
You know, I think social media makes that 10 times worse because we look and we see what everybody else is doing and we think that we're the only ones that are suffering. And it's this idea of the cult of happiness it's such a pervasive idea that we need to present our best selves to the world that in some ways we're not even able to be honest with ourselves.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Keely Herron. Keely is a writer, a storyteller, and a strategist. Welcome, Keely.
Thank you for having me, Emmy. It's great to be here.
So I just want to talk about the work you've done on yourself and how that makes you a great storyteller.
Oh, gosh. I grew up in Minnesota, and my grandfather was Irish. And I don't know if you're familiar with stereotypes about Irish Americans or Irish people in general, but there's a lot of storytelling that goes on. And my grandfather's favorite pastime was to sit anywhere in the backyard or the living room or wherever and have a beverage. It could be a Pepsi or it could be a beer and tell stories. And so that's kind of how I grew up, spending time with my family. And humor was always a big part of that. And being able to tell a good story and make people laugh was something that I always aspired to do.
When did you decide that was going to be your passion in life, being a storyteller?
Well, you know, I started out as a writer, was always interested in writing, and I was the editor of my high school yearbook, and I wrote for the paper, and then I studied journalism at the University of Minnesota, and I was an arts and entertainment reporter for the Minnesota Daily, which is a great job if you're in college and you don't have any money, because I got to go to all kinds of events and concerts and dance performances and theater and art installations and everything, and then write about them. And somewhere along the lines, I picked up a camera and did photojournalism for a while, which led to design, which led to advertising. And so that's where I spent the majority of my career, was in advertising, and not as a writer actually, but as sort of an account manager and a strategist. And so that's where the strategy part of it came in, and a lot of writing also. But after I moved to Jackson and I worked for 2 years as the marketing director at Snow King, when I started my own business, it became clear to me right away that writing was the way to connect with local businesses, because it was something that they understood and knew that they needed. And so as I looked at how to develop my own business and make a little money and pay my rent, I just started writing again. And that kind of reawakened that latent passion, I guess, or just I've always loved to write. And so that's where that started. And it really kicked into high gear when I did the TEDx talk last summer.
And I wanted to ask you about your TEDx talk because it was called Leaving the Cult of Happiness.
Yes.
The only way out is through.
Yeah.
What was your talk about? What message? What was your greatest message there?
The message that I wanted to make sure to get across is that listening is not a passive practice. It's an act of healing. And that we can all change the world by learning to be good listeners, because everybody's broken, and it's just a question of how much and where. And by listening, people can begin to unravel the things that are difficult in life, and no one gets out alive. We all know where this life goes, and throughout that experience of being human, everyone is bound to suffer. And so some people have, really big burdens, and some people get lucky and they don't have as large of a burden, but everyone suffers. And I think the lesson that I learned from the things that I've experienced in life is that having a friend who was willing to listen to me and not judge me, and also not diminish what I was experiencing, not say like, oh, it's going to be okay, or as Brene Brown says, to silver lining it, like, oh, well, at least you can have kids, or at least, you find out that your child has some kind of a disease, and then people are like, oh, well, at least you have a child, at least they're still alive. And it's like, it's difficult to be able to sit with something that's really challenging if the people around you don't sit with you too. And so that's where I came to my conclusion of that talk, which is that, listening, even if it's uncomfortable, or even if you don't have anything to say, or you don't have any recommendations or advice, the simple act of sitting beside someone and listening to them and just bearing witness to what they're going through is an act of healing. And everybody can do that. Everybody can learn to listen.
And how is that a part of the cult of happiness? How did that message come through and get woven in there?
I've had my share of stuff that I needed to work through. And there are people who I realized the second I said, I'm having a bad day, that I couldn't go any further. There are some people that they just don't have the capacity to deal with anything that's not bright and shiny. And I think that there are a lot of people, specifically in American culture, but in Western culture in general, and in a lot of cultures around the world, where anything that's not bright and shiny and happy is just not discussed. So even with the people that are closest to you, you're hiding who you really are because it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to discuss in polite company, even with the people that are closest to you. And so the idea of the cult of happiness is that we're all trying to put a shiny facade on whatever we're dealing with. And we're not able to come to the table and say, like, this really sucks. I'm really struggling. I don't know what to do. And, I think social media makes that 10 times worse because we look and we see what everybody else is doing, and we think that we're the only ones that are suffering. And it's this idea of the cult of happiness it's such a pervasive idea that we need to present our best selves to the world that in some ways we're not even able to be honest with ourselves if we're suffering.
Do you think it comes from the rhetoric that people say, I don't want to be around
negative people? Yeah, toxic people or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
I get into it with friends and acquaintances about the positive psychology movement. I think there's a lot of value in the positive psychology movement. I think that it's a slippery slope when we look at real mental illness, and then also trauma. When people are dealing with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, there's only so much positive thinking that you can do that's going to help shift something that's really deeply lodged. And I guess that's the only way that I can explain trauma is, I've done a lot of work with, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, group work. And for me, I'm 43 years old, and where I've finally gotten to is the point where I realize that it is an energetic shift. And I don't know where that's going to go for me, but there's only so much you can do cognitively or rationally before you need to start getting into a deeper understanding of what trauma is and how we can really resolve it.
Do you think there's a place where you can help others as well, that you've learned from your own experience, that you can help others deal with their trauma?
Yeah, I think for me, part of the reason I was so excited to give the TEDx talk, is because I've always known that I would tell my story. I just didn't know how or where, in what form. Because as I looked at that experience and I lived with that experience and I worked through that experience, you do ask yourself, like, why me? Why do I have to do this? Like, why do I have to deal with all this? It's not fair. And you wallow around in that for a while. And I think after really working on it, the conclusion that I came to is why I had to deal with these things is so that I could help even one other person figure out why they have to deal with it too. So by telling my story and just being really honest about how difficult it has been to overcome some of these things, maybe a younger person who's maybe still in the middle of it can get help faster and can get from A to B a little bit faster than I did at 43.
Do you think that storytelling just comes naturally to you? Or
Well, I joke that when I die, you're going to have to pull the mic from my cold, dead hands. I come by it naturally. That's what my family has always done. We'll sit around after dinner and for hours and hours and hours. And my brother and I joke that when we talk to our aunt on the phone, we have to set a timer because otherwise it's like we'll be on the phone with her for 3 hours, literally. And it's just stories. And it's the voices and the characters and all, and we tell the same stories over and over again and we still think they're funny. So, perhaps it's in my genes. And, I think if I can use my voice to, like I said, to help someone, I think it helps make everything that I've done have meaning and make sense.
I think it's great you want to be a storyteller. I think I've read some quotes that storytelling is the oldest form of education.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the stories in the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or any of those. I mean, they were all oral traditions before they were written down. Mm-hmm. And that's the way that we understand the world.
So when you talk about your trauma, what is that trauma?
Well, so as I spoke about in my TEDx talk, part of the reason that I even began the conversation with the committee who select the speakers for TEDx was because my father committed suicide. My father died by suicide. And I've been pretty open about that, and I am an advocate for mental health equity and mental illness awareness. And then as conversation continued with the steering committee, we just started talking about other things that I had experienced that informed kind of my perspective on what ended up being the subject of the talk, which was the cult of happiness. And that was some additional sexual trauma. I was raped when I was 16, and I was also first sexually abused when I was 5 years old. And so those were experiences in my life that absolutely shaped who I am. And it's, since the wars in the Middle East and a lot of the soldiers coming back, the awareness of PTSD has grown. For that, I'm very grateful. And I think the understanding of complex PTSD, which is generally how people understand things that happen when you're much younger, the experience manifests as what they call complex PTSD. And so that's kind of become the envelope or the bucket of what I want to talk about is our understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and our collective ability to listen to those stories and to overcome the stigma that is attached to some of the things that really traumatize people.
And so sometimes you find that makes people uncomfortable
Very.
When you talk to them about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I get it. I mean, I get it. I get, it's not pleasant. If I never had to talk about it ever again, I wouldn't probably. But it's part of who I am. It's a part of what shaped me and made me who I am. And unfortunately, my experience with trauma is that it's not something that you just put in a box and put on a shelf and just walk away from. It's something that I deal with not every single day, but it doesn't just go away.
It manifests itself in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And it's, I hate to use the word triggered because that's such a snowflakey word now. But it is, like a certain interaction with someone who has nothing to do with an incident that happened 40 years ago can just set me off. And that's my reality.
What can you tell people that they can walk away with, that you've learned, that you feel better about yourself, that you've a great outlook on life and a bright future?
I would say it's a process. It's a process, and that it's not linear. It's difficult to do this in audio, but I feel like my trajectory has been very much like loop-de-loops. I'll go forward and then come up the loop-de-loop and back down the loop-de-loop and then go a little bit forward and up and back down. And I do make progress, but it's not always forward. Sometimes it's a little bit circular. And I think finding a single person who is able to sit with you when things are tough can make a huge difference, and to just be patient and to find a single person who is able to bear witness. And you just keep trying, and it's not always going to be forward. Sometimes it's going to be backwards. Mm-hmm. But to be patient and to understand that life is not all, that there is value and meaning in the suffering. We don't choose it. If I never had to suffer, I would prefer that. But, you go to war with the army that you have. You play the cards that you're dealt. And when you've got crappy cards, you still have to play them. And to take a step back from the idea that life is all about happiness and fulfillment and success and achievement. That's definitely a big part of life, and we strive for that. But there is also value and honor and dignity and self-respect and respect for others and things that we can learn about life and who we are as people and what gives life meaning. All of those things can be found in the shadow side too.
Success looks different for everyone, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not about money and cars and,
right.
Mm-hmm. It can be. And Lord knows I would love an Audi Q5, but that's not what gives life meaning.
Right. I think it's a great thing that you're doing this.
Thanks.
I wish you so much luck.
Thank you.
I can't wait to hear where you go next with your storytelling.
Thanks. Yeah, me too. We'll see. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm working on it.
Good. Thanks, Keely.
Thanks, Emmy.
Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.